Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming along tonight. Last night, in summary, for those of you who weren't here, we went back through, we saw that the media over the last decade or so had tried, we believe, in our opinion, to discredit the royal family. And it brought out that in The Guardian, one of the journalists had said, Ross Benson, that many people believe that there was a conspiracy to destroy the royal family. We asked the question, who would want to destroy the royal family? So we went back through history and looked at the enemies of Britain and their freedoms. And we did show some startling facts. Some of them may have offended some people. They have in other places around the world where I've shown this presentation, but nevertheless they were facts that we would discard at our own peril. And so we went back, we showed what had happened between the church and state being united for 1260 years of the Dark Ages. We showed the papacy, sadly, while it claimed to be the only representative of Jesus Christ on this earth, actually believed that had a divinely given right to kill all those that didn't believe what they happened to be believing at the time. We saw that the English mind and character, which had been chiselled out over the last 400 or 500 years since the time of the Reformation, we saw that it was being undermined and the English were being herded in to the European Union. We saw that in the European Union, through symbolism and other signs, that it was a papal trap for the freedoms and the wonderful heritage that the English have developed for themselves, and which has been the envy of the world. We saw that Henry VIII had discarded the secular power of Rome. We saw Bloody Mary lying her way to the throne and then killing those that dared to exercise their conscience, which God had given us all. We saw that although Rome claimed to have the power and right to force their will on others, we saw that the Bible said that Christ would harm no man and he would force no man to his allegiance. And so there would be no one in heaven that was there by force. Each one would be there because they loved God and wanted to follow him. We saw also that Elizabeth I defied the Pope and said that there'd be she recognised no king in her realm but Jesus Christ. That was an affront to the Pope, who had claimed to be vicar of the whole world. We saw his triple tiara, which said he was king of heaven, king of earth, and king of the lower regions. While I wouldn't debate his third claim, I certainly have reservations about him being king of this earth, because Christ had said in John 18:36 that my kingdom is not of this earth, and if it was, I would fight. And so we went on down through history and showed that the Spanish Armada had sailed on England specifically to destroy the Protestant freedom, that the English became a Protestant nation, and they worked out the best democratic system where they would govern themselves. And then we saw Charles I, Charles II, Cromwell, James II, and then William III, and the constitutional monarchy, which we still have to a point today, where the power of the king would be limited to being the referee and making sure that the people's interests of England and the British Commonwealth were guaranteed from papal aggression by being the head of the state and being head of or chief layman of the Church of England. We saw clearly that we've all enjoyed these freedoms, but today most in England are playing football or cricket or making money, and while this is going on, we see the secret societies of the Catholic Church, the Jesuits and Opus Dei, getting into strategic positions where their first loyalty is not to the taxpayers of England who pays them, but their first loyalty is to the Pope of Rome, who wants a new world order. We saw that the Catholics were emancipated in England in 1829. The hierarchical system was set up again in 1850, and then we saw their involvement in the First, Second World War, and then in the European Union today. And I've been criticised, and we're holding meetings in Eastbourne next week, and we've heard already that there's a great deal of opposition. But I would say this: when the Pope calls for a new world order, friends, and if we know of the history of the papacy, which sadly has killed upwards of 100 million people, that's history. I'm not making that up. And it doesn't make me a hate monger for quoting history. The problem lies with the Vatican, who believes they have a right to kill others who don't happen to believe whatever they happen to be teaching at the time. So when the Pope calls for a new world order, you and I have a right to ask what sort of a new world order it's going to be. And where is our liberties and freedoms going to fit into this? My brother over there gave me these wonderful photos of the unification between the head of the Church of England and the Pope. Well, I can tell you, friend, if a fox and a rabbit decide to get married, the rabbit's not going to have much say in which way they're going to go or where they're going to play. And I'm saying that it's time that we started having a little bit of eternal vigilance. And you're going to see tonight some shocking facts, but I urge you to look at them in a constructive manner, because although they might be shocking, they're still facts that we would reject at our own peril. Now, we showed last night, before we start tonight, we showed that the papacy was using symbolism. So while the Europeans and the English were busy playing football, etc., and making money and enjoying life, they had no idea that there was being a noose placed around their neck to deny them the freedoms that their forefathers spilt their blood for you and I to enjoy today. And yet we saw through symbolism that the papacy was taking control of Europe and, I might add, the world. And we saw that the blue in this tract, some of that symbolism, incidentally, is right here on this page of the tract. But we saw that the beautiful-looking European flag, the blue, stood for Mother Mary, which the Catholic Church have deified. We also see that the gold stands for the Vatican. And so tonight, where is all the centralising of economic and political power and religious power leading us? Tonight we're going to show you that it's been predicted in the Bible. Now, some of you might be skeptics. I know how you feel. 25 years ago I picked up this Bible to disprove it. And I publicly proclaimed in my town that it wouldn't take me long to do. And I didn't think that I'd be touring the world today telling people that there is hope for lost humanity. There is a better world to come. And I'm going to tell you tonight, not because I'm a clairvoyant, but because I believe anybody who understands English, you do not have to understand the Hebrew and the Greek, but if you understand the English, you can understand the codes of prophecy which are tonight we're going to show you, tell the future. We were in Hyde Park, as I mentioned last night on Sunday, and I was amazed at the fanaticism of the Muslims. They were screaming and yelling and carrying on and telling us that Allah alone was God. And I said to him, as I mentioned last night, but I mention again at the risk of boring those that were here last night, for those that weren't, I want to let you know that I said to them, well, you worship a dead God. Why? Because he must be on holiday, because he hasn't helped you much in Iraq and in the war of a decade ago. I'm a pacifist and I'm against war, but if Allah was as wonderful as they claimed him to be, then they should have won the war. But the point I want to bring out is that I was told that this Bible tells the future. The living God used various men over 1,500 years to write down what the future would hold. When I first spoke to a man, I thought the problems of the world would be solved by blowing up banks and attacking various institutions, until I was told, and I had a lot of Irish Catholic friends, and I was going to become a Catholic, but much to my horror I found I had been misled and I had been deceived. But that aside, I found that this old man handed me the Bible, and I said to my girlfriend, honey, this guy's a religious nutter. We've got to get out of here. But before we do, I'll put him in his place. And he said to me, you know, it's all predicted in the Bible. And I said, I'll fix him. Yeah, it all depends on the interpretation. Now, I thought that would blow him away, because there's lots of people out there that criticize the Bible, but they've never read it in their life. And I was one of those people 25 years ago. And so I said to him, it all depends on the interpretation. So he handed me the Bible and said, show me what you mean. And I went, yes. He said, show me what you mean. And I said, I can't. He said, woe unto him who judgeth before he heareth. So I took that rebuke that night, and I picked up the Bible to disprove it, and I found that it was the greatest book that ever was written. And I know it was inspired by God through holy men, because it can tell the future. You and I do not know what lies ahead for planet Earth. until we understand and unravel the prophecies of the Bible. And so with that basic introduction, we're going to go right now and find out what is happening in the world today. Here we see things that politicians have no control over, although some people think that through satellites and weather changing patterns, people who want a new world order are creating problems in order for us to solve, for them to solve it by taking our freedoms off us with the remedy. Here we see earthquakes and floods. We see the rich getting richer while the poor are starving to death. We see fires and violence in the streets as never before. We see floods and innocent babies destroyed and washed up on the beaches. We see innocent ones blown up in terrorist attacks. We see the Western world playing golf and drinking while poor little ones in Africa are starving to death. We see AIDS and diseases ripping the planet, and we see terrible tragedies and the great thoroughfares of travel. We see war and bloodshed, and we see the Pope touring the world preaching of peace and justice. We see him meeting various dignitaries. We see the hatred, ethnic hatred in wars. Is time running out for planet Earth? Will humanity solve its problems? Can we predict the future? Let's find out. See, the Bible itself says in Isaiah 46:9 and 10, I am God and there is none like me, declaring from ancient times that which are not yet done. That which is not yet done. We also have a more sure word of prophecy. We have also a more sure word of prophecy, whereunto you do well that you take heed, as unto a light that shineth in a dark place. Knowing this first, that no prophecy of the Scripture is of any private interpretation, but holy men of God spoke as they were moved by the Holy Ghost. Now this is an amazing prophecy which basically states, it's in Ezekiel chapter 29 and 30, and it actually predicted that the mighty nation of Egypt would become a base nation. It never said it would be destroyed utterly, as some nations, their fate was predicted because of their disobedience, but it said that it would become a base nation. And that's what Egypt is today. Once it was the greatest nation in the world, but because of their disobedience, God predicted, because of their disobedience, that they would become a base nation, and that's exactly what's happened. The greatest nation or empire that the world ever saw was Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon. It was predicted in Isaiah 13:19 to 21 that Babylon would be completely destroyed and never built again. And that's happened to this day. Petra, the great stone city cut out of the cliffs, it also was predicted that no one would dwell in it and there would be no inhabitants. Now this is one of the most amazing prophecies in the Bible. It predicted, it was referring to Tyre, the prediction said that fishing nets would be dried out on it. And they shall destroy the walls of Tyrus and break down her towers. I will also scrape the dust from her and make her like the top of a rock. It shall be a place for the spreading of nets in the midst of the sea. For I have spoken it, says the Lord God. And they shall lay thy stones and thy timber and thy dust in the midst of the water. Thou shalt be built no more, for I am the Lord, I the Lord have spoken it, says the Lord God. And there we see the fishing nets being dried out today on the remains of Tyre. What actually happened? How did this prophecy be fulfilled? Amazingly, there was the original island off the coast here. The original city of Tyre was there. The coastline ran straight down there. The old city of Tyre was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar in 585 BC. The first part of the prophecy had been fulfilled. Over 250 years later, or thereabouts, Alexander the Great came down, and all the people that lived around here fled to the island, which was 1/4 mile off the shore. Alexander the Great took all the remains of the old city, which had never been rebuilt, and he scraped the rocks to get the last bit of dust to build a causeway out to the island and kill all the inhabitants who had fled there. And then over the years, the tides and the currents have built the sand up on the remains, as you can see here, of the old pillars of Tyrus. until it's now a peninsula, and along that peninsula the fishing boats dry their nets out on it. What a wonderful fulfillment of that prophecy. And now we see another one in Nahum chapter 2 from thousands of years ago. Their chariots shall be with flaming torches in the day of his preparation. The chariots shall rage in the streets. They shall jostle one against another in the broad ways. They shall seem like torches. They shall run like lightning. Poor old Nahum didn't know in those days what the vision he was seeing of today's jostling on the motorways, I believe. Another prediction was, in Daniel 12:4, was that in the last days many shall run to and fro. I was in Los Angeles airport the other day, and then in London airport, and we've all been in airports around the world to see the people rushing to and fro. 150 years ago, people never moved any further than 10 miles from their hometown. And for thousands of years, up until 150 years, the only mode of transport was the horse. And so people today are running to and fro. And the reason for that, friends, is because knowledge shall be increased. These were predictions of the end times before the coming of the Lord. For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in diverse places. All these are the beginning of sorrows, Matthew 24:7 and 8. And then we see, this is an amazing prediction of all the world empires. Many of you have heard of the great vision of Daniel chapter 2, which Nebuchadnezzar had, that the wise men of Babylon, or the Chaldeans, could not interpret, but God's dear servant Daniel was given the wisdom to interpret the vision. But in Matthew 24:15, we're told, when ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, stand in the holy place. So Jesus told us to understand the book of Daniel. Many Christians I meet today say that the Old Testament doesn't matter. But I say that most of the wisdom that we need today comes from there. And so in Daniel 2, we've seen this great image that Daniel had interpreted, that Nebuchadnezzar had seen in a dream. Because Nebuchadnezzar thought that his kingdom would last forever. But God was showing him that it wouldn't last forever. The first kingdom was Babylon. It was represented by the head of gold. Persia, Medo-Persia, was the next empire. The two arms, saying a dual empire, was of silver, a lesser mineral or element, and that was the torso, the top, the shoulders and arms. Greece was the midriff here, and that was brass. And the next great empire was Rome. And then the 10 nations of Europe would be divided, the feet and the toes, the mirror clay at the bottom of that image. And then in the time of those nations of Europe, or the feet, a great stone that goes on, cut out without hands. It represented the coming of the Lord, would come and destroy this licentious and wicked world. We then saw, can you go back one on that slide here, please? In Daniel chapter 7, we saw exactly the same vision, but this time God used beasts as the symbol. And if we understand what these beasts are, that they represent nations, we will better understand tomorrow night what the mark of the beast is. And incidentally, the mark of the beast, the Bible predicts, or it says, that no man shall buy nor sell unless he receives the mark of the beast. Whatever that mark of the beast is, we have to find out. I met a man once that told me that he knew what the mark of the beast was. And I said, how do you know? He said, I was in Kathmandu and I met a guru there who told me what the mark of the beast was. And I said, well, friend, you're entitled to believe that. What did he say it was? He said it was a great computer in Brussels. I said, I know what you're talking about. I used to believe that. I used to teach it on the streets with all the energy that I could muster. But friends, till a man took me aside and said, I admire your enthusiasm, but you're deceived. And of course, like any weak human being, I reacted and said, I am not deceived. That's the first thing a human being does. He doesn't want to accept that he's wrong. But this man painstakingly went over things with me, and he showed that I was not only deceived, but I was deceiving others. The Bible says in Revelation chapter 14 that if any man receives the mark of the beast in his forehead or in his right hand, the same shall drink from the cup of the wrath of God poured out without mixture. So whatever the mark of the beast is, we must be sure that we find out what it is and that we're not deceived by the myriad of different deceptions that are about. And so I said to this friend of mine, do you know the only place in the world where the mark of the beast is mentioned? And he said, no. I said, in the Bible. So if God put such a fearful retribution in the Bible for those that receive the mark of the beast, surely a fair and long-suffering God would also put a clear explanation of what the mark of the beast is for those who wish to know the truth, uncomfortable as it may make them, unpopular that it may make them in this world. And so we saw Daniel 7 explain the same kingdoms. That was the ten empires that, of the 10 toes that Daniel chapter 2 broke up into when the pagan Roman Empire under the Caesars broke up about 476 AD. But then we see Babylon as a lion with two wings. Those of you who were here last night saw the papers on the Venice Cathedral. Remember the lion with the two wings? And Japanese and American tourists photographed these great buildings and they don't know the symbolism on it. But here we see Babylon, the head of gold, is here represented as a lion with wings. The wings meant swiftness of conquest. The Medo-Persian Empire was the bear raised up on one side, which represented the Persians were more powerful in the union of Medo-Persia, and the three ribs in the mouth showed the three empires that had been destroyed by the Medo-Persians. After that then came the Greeks, then we saw a four-headed beast, a leopard, with four wings, showing that Alexander's conquests were like lightning. And of course, when he died prematurely through drunkenness, he had conquered the world, but he hadn't conquered his own passions. And so the most powerful man in the world died prematurely at the age of 34 through drunken debauchery. His empire broke up into the four kingdoms that history shows us, and then next came this terrible nondescript beast with 10 horns on its head. The 10 horns, of course, represent 10 powers. And we believe that was pagan Rome, and the 10 horns were the same 10 toes of Daniel chapter 2, which you saw here, which were the 10 nations of Europe, which after the pagan Roman Empire broke up into the nations of Europe. Yes, please. Prophecy of Daniel 7:25 goes on to say that another little horn rose up amongst those 10 horns from pagan Rome under the Caesars, and this is one of the most amazing prophecies of the Bible. It rose up out of the fourth beast. It didn't come up out of China or Cairo or Peking. It came up right out of pagan Rome. It came up among the 10 horns. It came after the 10 horns. It was different from the other horns because this was a religio-political power. And then we saw that it uprooted 3 of the kingdoms, did it not? The Vandals, the Ostrogoths, and the Hurrites were destroyed. And then we see that this new power spoke great words against the Most High. Last night you found out that it did that. It claimed to be Holy Father, where we saw the Bible said, all ye are brethren, and call no man father upon this earth. Of course, you could call your physical father, because the 5th commandment said, honour your mother and father. But in religious matters, the Bible said, we were all brethren. And so it spoke great words against the Most High. And then we see here it wore out the saints of the Most High. Sadly, it has killed upwards of 100 million people throughout the ages. The history books of England and Europe testify of that, where Christ had said, harm no man and do good to those that despitefully use you, Matthew 5:44. And so it wore out the saints of the Most High. And then it thought to change times and the laws. There was only one law with time in it, and the papacy changed that 4th commandment. You're going to find that out tomorrow night. And it openly claims, yes, we have changed the commandments of God. I, as a Protestant of English and Scottish stock, disagree with that we cannot change the law of God, and the greatest indicator to the permanency of the law of God was Calvary. If God could change the commandments that he made, he could have changed them to fit in with Adam and Eve, our first parent's sin, rather than send his son to be mocked and humiliated on Calvary, to pay the price for fallen humanity, for their transgressions of the law, rather than bring eternal death upon them. And so they did change the commandments of God. They also took out the second commandment, as we mentioned last night. And it would rule, in Bible prophecy, it said it would rule for 1260 years. And so we then see the last of the Caesars giving his title to the first of the popes. And then we see, did it cast the truth of God to the ground according to Daniel 8:12? It did. We saw last night the papacy burnt the Bible in London and in many other places. We saw last night that they burnt them up until as late as 1923 under Mussolini in Rome. Here we see Pope Leo XIII taking the most blasphemous title you could get, Most Holy Father. And I quoted those before, call no man your father upon the earth. That doesn't include your physical dad, but in religious matters. And it says here, for thou only art holy. That's talking to God. And then we see, did they wear out the saints of the Most High? They killed 750,000 Dutch Protestants alone, friends. They burnt the Bible, and they changed the commandments of God, and here we see a very symbolic picture. We see the unification of church and state. We see the church here, the priest, asking the state here to kill the saints of God and burn their Bibles. And that is a danger of the unification of church and state, friends, which we disagree with, which is coming in the European Union again. And it was under Charlemagne and all, where the conscience of each individual was decided by the Catholic Church. Did it rule for 1260 years? Exactly. If the Justinian decree of 538 AD was the start, and we add on 1260 years to that, we get to 1798. Well, if God's word is as sure as he says it is, then something had to happen to the Vatican in 1798. If we go to the history books, we see in exactly that year, Berthier, the Roman Republican French general, captured Pope Pius VI, and he was taken prisoner into France. And many people said, good riddance, the Vatican, the intolerant Vatican, which has taught error for so long, has finally had retribution from God. But those who understood the Bible were not quite so cocky, because it said in Revelation now, in Revelation 13:3, it said that this beast that received the wound, it would be healed, that the deadly wound was healed, and all the world wondered after the beast. And so I saw one of its heads that was wounded to death, so we saw the wound, the healing, and then all the world wondering. Now this beast had come up out of the sea. In Bible prophecy, according to Revelation 17:15, a sea is a populated area. I mention that because the second beast or kingdom of Revelation 13 comes up out of a sparsely populated area, or a sparsely populated area. And so we see the beast was wounded, or the power of the papacy was wounded. But then we see its deadly wound was healed when Gaspari and Mussolini, the good Catholic boy, signed the Lateran Treaty, which gave the Pope back his secular power, as well as his religious power. And then the third part of that vision was all the world would wonder after the beast. And there we see all the world. The Pope has toured to dozens of countries. Here we see him being received in Brazil. There's 1 million people there welcoming the Pope. This dog is not quite so sure. Then we saw here the second beast of Revelation chapter 13 was this beast, and I beheld another beast coming up out of the earth, a sparsely populated area, and he had 2 horns like a lamb. And so this power that came up about the time that the first beast went down, it spoke as a lamb. And I believe those 2 horns represented the separation of the religious power in America through the First Amendment to the Constitution from the political power. And by separating church and state, I might add that when the American pilgrims left England to set up a better way of life, they separated church and state, not because they were irreligious quite the contrary. They separated church and state eventually because they, being religious, felt no desire to force their particular understanding of Bible on anybody else. And the only way to do that is keep the church out of politics. The state would legislate law and order, and the church could preach Jesus Christ crucified, and people could choose to accept him or reject him and answer to God on the judgment day themselves. That's what God requires, and that's what in the Bible, as we found out last night in Matthew chapter 22, verse 21. But this beast that rose out of an unpopulated area and behaved like a lamb, America's last 200 years of history allowed every down and out in the world to come there and worship God or not worship God according to the dictates of their conscience. America certainly fulfilled that part, that it was a lamb. And remember, the reason it spoke as a lamb was because it had two horns, or it separated the two powers of church and state. But then the Bible warned us that America was going to speak as a dragon. America, the Bible said, would speak as a dragon. Here we see the pilgrims leaving England. They took the Bible with them. They arrived in America. When they arrived there, many of them had died of disease. There was no Kentucky Fried Chicken shop there they could just pull into and have a go on the motorway up there in their cars. There was a great deal of tragedy and despair. But they went there so they could worship God according to the dictates of their conscience without having a united church and state telling them where to go. There they were at one of the early Thanksgiving dinners as they built the nation. Here we see what Rome hated. The Constitution of the United States said, "We the people." The people would have the say in America, not the kings and not the bureaucrats. And so we saw, to safeguard this freedom, we saw three levels of government. We saw the legislative council that makes the laws. We saw the executive in the White House and the Pentagon, etc., which would govern those laws or execute those laws. And then we saw the judicial system, which would penalise those who broke the laws. And so we saw this great beast that came up out of the earth. Its constitution, through the First Amendment, allowed everybody to worship God according to the dictates of their conscience, or not worship God according to the dictates of their conscience. But then we saw, because it was two horns and they separated church and state, they gave us liberty for all. And then we saw, here the statue outside the Archives building on Constitution Avenue, Washington. We saw this fierce warrior with a look on his face. And down here it says, "Eternal vigilance is the price of liberty." For centuries, the American Protestants protected their liberties, which they knew their forefathers had wrought out for them with the spilling of a great deal of blood. But today in America, there is no longer any eternal vigilance. They're playing sport. They're mad on making money. They're mad on sport. And while they're playing games, we're going to find out there is a power that is subtly removing their freedoms. So we see here the papacy to gain control by the Catholic vote. And here we see Rome demands freedom solely for herself. The Roman Catholic Church must demand the right to freedom for herself. We saw the Catholic vote in America has increased because of Catholic immigration. And even if the Catholic Church taught truth, which we showed last night and will show tomorrow night it doesn't, God would not even permit a church that preaches his truth that Christ taught 2,000 years ago. He would not have them unite with the state to force their will on anybody, right? There'll be no one in heaven there by force. Everybody who will be in heaven will be there because they saw the long suffering and the goodness of God. Let's push on. Now we see the Pope at the beginning of his bishopric urged all Catholics to take positions in strategic positions in the bureaucracy and government to further the ends of the Catholic Church. They actually believe that they're working for the benefit of the world. And I actually believe that. When I saw the obvious evils in the world of communism and abortion and robbery and atheism, as I said, communism, all these bad things in the world, I reacted and I looked for someone who was preaching about peace and justice, and I nearly became a Roman Catholic. But someone told me, be careful, you're jumping off the Titanic onto the Lusitania. You see, you're backing away from one obvious evil, and I saw Freemasonry was evil, the Jewish money power, all these things, but the devil is capable of building up one power to look evil to make another power, which is also evil, look good. And so that's the type of dialectics we're coming across. At the beginning of the Pope's bishopric, he urged all Catholics to get into positions of political power and better the world. Here, Malachi Martin, the Jesuit who is since deceased, spoke about the Jesuits and their underhand tactics. And the old Roman Senate itself did not lay schemes for world domination with greater certainty of success than the Jesuits. And now we see Catholics should be recognised as official US state religion. That was made in Church and State by Miller and it doesn't matter, Miller and the Jesuit, and that has come to fruition in Protestant America. Here we see two of the High Court judges, Rehnquist, a Roman Catholic, and Scalia, a Jesuit-trained Rehnquist, at the opening of the Supreme Court Mass in Washington with Cardinal Bernard Law of Boston. They want to be there. Now we see Father Daniel P. Coughlin is now the chaplain to the House of Representatives in the United States, but there were many Protestants that couldn't believe their eyes, and Daniel P. Coughlin would be the next House chaplain. He angrily denied any anti-Catholic bias and initially passing over another priest for the job. So they are gaining power throughout the world, and they think they're doing it for God. Here we see the greatest group in Congress today is the Catholic group, the lobby. Here we see the man of the year was Newt Gingrich. He's since been deposed, but at that time he laid a foundation for the taking over of the United States by the papacy, as he's a good Roman Catholic. Here we now see these two powers that had diametrically opposite principles. From one received the wound, the deadly wound was healed in 1929, and then all the world wanted after the beast. And then we saw the second beast, which fled Europe from intolerance and popery and the union of church and state, put it in their First Amendment to separate church and state so everybody would be free in religious matters. And now we see these two powers, which were diametrically opposed, coming together to fight a common enemy that the devil has raised up over here called communism. What a way to have Protestantism absorbed into Catholicism by bringing a common enemy. That happened in the time of the Reformation with the Turks. When the Turks came upon Europe, Luther and the Protestants of Europe were urged to unite with the Catholics to fight the common enemy of the Turks. The devil was using the same thing again. And so we saw exactly what Revelation 13 had predicted, that these two powers, which had diametrically opposed foundations, would unite against a common enemy. And here we see the Holy Alliance between the United States and the Vatican. Some, however, thought it was an unholy alliance. But there we saw the Roman Catholic Casey, who was in charge of the who was in charge of the CIA, doing his bit. And the first thing they did, the United States is soon to exercise all the power of the papacy. And I beheld another beast coming up out of the earth. And he had two horns like a lamb, and he spoke as a dragon. And so this power that rose as a lamb, that gave liberty to all, would soon speak as a dragon. And when it spoke as a dragon, he, the United States, would exercise all the power of the first beast before him. So if we understand history, we're going to see what's going to be exercised in the name of God, of course, by the United States of America. And he exercises all the power of the first beast before him. That's how we know this beast that had to come up about the time that the first beast was going down, and that within a few years the United States fulfills that prophecy exactly. The first beast before him, that was the papacy, and causes the earth and them which dwell therein to worship the first beast whose deadly wound was healed. Revelation 13, 11 and 12. And so we see the second beast, that's the United States, pays homage to the first beast. The best way to honour Pope John Paul II, says William Bush, truly one of the great men, is to take his teaching seriously, is to listen to his words and to put his words and teachings into action here in America. This is a challenge we must accept. Isn't that interesting? And the second beast here flatters the first beast. The heads of the Catholic Church in America are with the President of the United States. We have to push on. And now we see they exchange gifts. And now we see here the second beast pays homage. He calls him Holy Father, says Bush. And so we see this unification coming. I have to move along a bit. I'm conscious of that clock up there. But we see now these two beasts united against the obvious evils in the world. And because they recognise the obvious evils in the world, it doesn't necessarily make them right. The Pope was in St. Louis several years ago, and I met a very delightful Roman Catholic priest. And he said to me, we must get back to a good old-fashioned Christian society. And I said, why is that? And he said, because of all the wickedness in the world. Like what? Homosexuality, abortion, communism, all these things. Well, that's all right. I said to him, but I met a Muslim who recognised these same obvious evils that you see. So why don't we logically legislate his religion? Isn't that a fair comment? Why do we just have to legislate Catholicism? Because we all recognise the obvious evils of communism. So why shouldn't we legislate the Muslim faith if we recognise evils? And so he had to agree that his case was not a strong one. The Holy Alliance brought down communism. That in itself wasn't a bad thing. There were people that lived under communism, but it doesn't make these powers right. And people in Poland are finding out they are exchanging the red jacket of communism for the black jacket of the priesthood, and they're being dictated to in their matters of conscience. And so we see the revolt against communism in China, Poland, and the USSR. We're going to see a principle now that they have used throughout the world, and that was to bring people into the streets. Bring the people into the streets to bring these different governments, which they have rejected, to an end. Pope brings down Iron Curtain. 2 million linked in Balkan protest. Baltic plans mass protest. Riot police break-up protest. That's in Poland. Huge rally defies Soviet warnings. The Pope in the United States realised that if they could get the people motivated, they could destroy communism. People power. That's what it was, says Time magazine. And of course, the Berlin Wall came down, and families were united after 40 or 50 years. Now we see the CIA-sponsored solidarity in Poland helped bring down Poland. It wasn't, at the time of the fall of communism, the Pope's part in it was not generally accepted. But now the newspapers later on, 6 or 7 years later, came out and showed that the Pope's role in the collapse of communism. The KGB knew exactly, they worked out what the papacy was doing, and that the Pope was behind the downfall and the demise of communism. And so they tried to kill the Pope. Here we see Time magazine's equivalent in Canada saying it was the ultimate blasphemy to kill the Pope. Well, we're pacifists, I hope, and that we bear no grudge against the Pope, deceived as he may be to think that he's God on this earth when he's only a human being like you and I are. But at the same time, friends, no one would want to see him shot, to suffer the discomfort of injury at the hands of an assassin. But at the same time, friends, we do believe we have a right not to speak against individuals, but against systems that are deceiving people. And around the world today, many honest Catholics are waking up what is going on and are leaving this doomed organisation. Now we see what happened in Croatia. US and the Vatican aid Roman Catholic Croatia against Orthodox Serbs. Eastern Europe, under the Orthodox, which split in about 1054 AD over the supremacy of the Pope, we see Western Europe was under Catholicism and the rule of the infallible Pope, so-called, and the friction line was right there in Yugoslavia between the Serbs and the Catholics. Croatia was a Catholic nation, and the United States, these two beasts from Revelation 13 unite to destroy Yugoslavia. And of course we see the United States aids Catholic Croatia, and then we see US hits Serbs but aids Catholic Croats. The Time magazine does their bit, saying bringing the Serbs to heel. At this point I'd like to say that Slobodan Milosevic is being put on trial in the International War Crimes Court in The Hague, but the Catholic head of the Croats Tudjman, who's since died, he was never put on trial for his murders. Just the same as Ariel Sharon is allowed to kill Palestinians and Muslims in the Middle East, but he's not allowed to be put on trial. And I'm saying it's hypocrisy to see such double standards. It all depends on who you know, whether you're part and partial to these powers that are wanting to take over the world. But as I mentioned last night, I am comforted to know that there is a judgment which we must all give an account at the bar of God, where the judge cannot be bought and sold with gold and silver, and that his decision is final. And so bringing the Serbs to heel. What happened during the Second World War? We found out last night that Hitler was a Roman Catholic and that the Vatican was behind the Second World War, and that they killed 1 million Serbs. They killed 1 million Serbs, Greek Orthodox Serbs. They asked them to, I showed you the picture of them having their throat cut, which was a terrible thing. You either converted to Catholicism or you died. And many converted, but many chose martyrdom rather than accept Catholicism. Kosovo was the heartland of the Serbs. The Ustashi, who you saw last night under Cardinal Stepanek, and Ustashi Catholic leader Pavelic, killed 1 million Serbs, and they obliterated 90% of the Serbs in their homeland Kosovo. After the war, the Albanian Muslims came in, and they now took their homes over, and they became the majority. So they have to move along a bit. I'm conscious of that clock up there, but we see now these two beasts united against the obvious evils in the world. And because they recognise the obvious evils in the world, it doesn't necessarily make them right. The Pope was in St. Louis several years ago, and I met a very delightful Roman Catholic priest. And he said to me, we must get back to a good old-fashioned Christian society. And I said, why is that? And he said, because of all the wickedness in the world. Like what? Homosexuality, abortion, communism, all these things. Well, that's all right. I said to him, but I met a Muslim who recognised these same obvious evils that you see. So why don't we logically legislate his religion? Isn't that a fair comment? Why do we just have to legislate Catholicism because we all recognise the obvious evils of communism? So why shouldn't we legislate the Muslim faith if we recognise evils? And so he had to agree that his case was not a strong one. The Holy Alliance brought down communism. That in itself wasn't a bad thing. There were people that lived under communism, but it doesn't make these powers right. And people in Poland are finding out they are exchanging the red jacket of communism for the black jacket of the priesthood, and they're being dictated to in their matters of conscience. And so we see the revolt against communism in China, Poland, and the USSR. We're going to see a principle now that they have used throughout the world, and that was to bring people into the streets. Bring the people into the streets to bring these different governments, which they have rejected, to an end. Pope brings down Iron Curtain. 2 million linked in Balkan protest. Baltic plans mass protest. Riot police break-up protest. That's in Poland. Huge rally defies Soviet warnings. The Pope in the United States realised that if they could get the people motivated, they could destroy communism. People power, that's what it was, says Time magazine. And of course, the Berlin Wall came down, and families were united after 40 or 50 years. Now we see the CIA-sponsored solidarity in Poland helped bring down Poland. It wasn't, at the time of the fall of communism, the Pope's part in it was not generally accepted. But now the newspapers later on, 6 or 7 years later, came out and showed that the Pope's role in the collapse of communism. The KGB knew exactly, they worked out what the papacy was doing, and that the Pope was behind the downfall and the demise of communism. And so they tried to kill the Pope. Here we see Time magazine's equivalent in Canada saying it was the ultimate blasphemy to kill the Pope. Well, we're pacifists, I hope, and that we bear no grudge against the Pope, deceived as he may be to think that he's God on this earth when he's only a human being like you and I are. But at the same time, friends, no one would want to see him shot, to suffer the discomfort of injury at the hands of an assassin. But at the same time, friends, we do believe we have a right not to speak against individuals, but against systems that are deceiving people. And around the world today, many honest Catholics are waking up what is going on, and they're leaving this doomed organisation. Now we see what happened in Croatia. US and the Vatican aid Roman Catholic Croatia against Orthodox Serbs. Eastern Europe, under the Orthodox, which split in about 1054 AD over the supremacy of the Pope, we see Western Europe was under Catholicism and the rule of the infallible Pope, so-called, and the friction line was right there in Yugoslavia between the Serbs and the Catholics. Croatia was a Catholic nation, and the United States, these two beasts from Revelation 13 unite to destroy Yugoslavia. And of course we see the United States aids Catholic Croatia, and then we see US hits Serbs but aids Catholic Croats. The Time magazine does their bit, saying bringing the Serbs to heel. At this point I'd like to say that Slobodan Milosevic is being put on trial in the International War Crimes Court in The Hague, but the Catholic head of the Croats, Tudjman, who's since died, he was never put on trial for his murders, just the same as Ariel Sharon is allowed to kill Palestinians and Muslims in the Middle East, but he's not allowed to be put on trial. And I'm saying it's hypocrisy to see such double standards. It all depends on who you know, whether you're part and parcel to these powers that are wanting to take over the world. But as I mentioned last night, I am comforted to know that there is a judgment which we must all give an account at the bar of God, where the judge cannot be bought and sold with gold and silver, and that his decision is final. And so bringing the Serbs to heel. What happened during the Second World War? We found out last night that Hitler was a Roman Catholic, and that the Vatican was behind the Second World War, and that they killed 1 million Serbs. They killed 1 million Serbs, Greek Orthodox Serbs. They asked them to, I showed you the picture of them having their throat cut, which is a terrible thing. You either converted to Catholicism or you died. And many converted, but many chose martyrdom rather than accept Catholicism. Kosovo was the heartland of the Serbs. The Ustashi, who you saw last night under Cardinal Stepanek and Ustashi Catholic leader Pavelic, killed 1 million Serbs, and they obliterated 90% of the Serbs in their homeland Kosovo. After the war, the Albanian Muslims came in, and they now took their homes over, and they became the majority. So then, over time, they started intimidating and assassinating the Serbs, now a minority because of the murders during the war or the Holocaust. They now were a minority, so Slobodan Milosevic comes in with his army to try and protect the Orthodox Serbs who were Christians from the new Muslim state which they were going to set up. And I saw in Hyde Park on Sunday, and I thought, these Muslims, if they were in the majority in England, you would be forced to be a Muslim. And if we went to their nations and exercised the same prerogatives that they were doing in Hyde Park, friends, we would have a short shift. And I'm aware of that. But so the Serbs brought to heel. And so these two beasts of Revelation 13, Time magazine is showing that all the Serb generals are crooks and villains, but all the Croats are wonderful. More financial shipments to Belgrade for the Roman Catholic Croats. Now we see Time magazine making Slobodan Milosevic a criminal, and here they're trying to give him the same hand as Catholic Hitler. This is the media, which I mentioned last night, is no longer interested in telling you the truth. It is only interested in conditioning you into believing what they want to believe, and that is that the world is in a hopeless state, and the only way it can be solved is with a new world order, which of course the Pope and his boys and international finance would run. Here we see Slobodan receiving tomato treatment, but the Serbs slammed the media reports about them. And so, but you'll never see that in the West. And so, Yugoslavia condemns the mass graves lies that were being spread, conditioning us to accept the attack upon Yugoslavia. Now here you will never see this picture in the West. Stop the New World Order terrorists, there's these protesters in Yugoslavia. And on the right we see Time magazine showing that they were going to target Slobodan Milosevic. And the blue, of course, is the blue of Mary, and the Pope believes that Mary is the one who's behind the unification of Europe. Last night I told you that Mary wasn't the mother of God. She was a good Jewish girl that God chose to use as a vessel to bring Jesus Christ into the world as a man for its salvation. And she is dead right now, awaiting the resurrection of God. And now we see Vatican satanic state. We wonder why the American flag is burnt there. Because of the two beasts under the guidance of the Vatican, and this second beast that spoke as a lamb and then would speak as a dragon would unite to force its will upon all. Now we see the Pope had said that Bosnia was a shipwreck of Europe. So it had to be dealt with. Here we see the reason for the war is the Greek Orthodox religion. They want to bring it back to once again be subject to the power of popery and its leadership. The Vatican first state to recognise Catholic Croatia. Here was a cartoon of the Vatican or the United States Catholic bishops forcing the United States State Department to officially recognise Catholic Croatia. And so we see the Vatican recognises in the Catholic world, Vatican recognises Croatia and Slovenia, another Catholic majority. The Catholic Weekly, Croats celebrate recognition. And so we see the CIA, Vatican-backed crowds topple Milosevic. CIA money was used to get them out onto the streets. And there we see Slobodan Milosevic with mud all over his face. It's over and out for him. And now we see all the Serb men rounded up as war criminals, but very few Croats were rounded up. No wonder the Serbs distrusted the world court case against Milosevic. And now we see Tudjman, the head of the Catholics, who committed many atrocities. He's exactly the same. We see the Croatian red and white flag here, and we see the Catholic priest in Croatia during the Second World War bringing the war against the Serbs. And we see Tudjman doing the same thing in this decade. Now we see what happened in the Rwandan massacre. I'm going to hurry along. We've got a few boxes of slides to show, but many people don't know that the Catholic Church, the Vatican, and today the Vatican is actually hiding many priests who are wanted by the Rwandan government for their crimes against the people. The two main races in Rwanda were the Hutus, who were Roman Catholics, and the Tutsis, who were Protestants. And one night, just like at the Bartholomew Night Massacre, which you saw last night, when the bell tolled at midnight, the Catholics rose up and killed upwards of 750,000 Protestants. And so we see the remains of a church here with one of the poor victims. We're going to find out now what happened. Kofi Annan knew of the genocide plans, but he didn't breathe a word to anybody about it, because he was told by France and other Catholic countries not to mention it. Here we see this poor child. Look, its mother being shot. 750,000 people is a lot of dead souls. It's hard for us to comprehend the size of this massacre. And yet, Rwanda was 65% Catholic. But when the massacres broke out, priests took part and churches served as slaughterhouses. They actually believed they were doing it in the name of God. Here we see this is the beginning of the final days. This is the apocalypse. Finally, the Protestants got on top. Although 750,000 of them were killed, they got on top and they took control of the situation, and many of the Catholics who had been killing fled into eastern Congo, where the refugee camps were, to avoid prosecution. Here we see when the Protestants got back on top, here's a Catholic priest who was involved with the genocide just minutes before the soldiers executed him for murder and genocide. Now we see priests face death over executions. And then we see Rwanda stirs up anti-UN feeling. Why? Because they were feeding, the Catholic-controlled Europe were feeding the Hutus, but not necessarily feeding the Protestants who were murdered. The Roman Catholic Prime Minister, he got a life sentence for his part in the genocide. And then we see here Time magazine in a rare moment of truth. Feeding the killers. Here we see, remember the blue and gold, the blue for Mary, the Hutus, the Roman Catholics are being fed by Catholic-controlled Europe, and Protestant Britain is being led into a Catholic-controlled Europe. And you're going to regret it, but it'll most probably happen too late. And England, I do not believe, will be saved from it, but individuals can be made aware of what is going on, and they can make the individual choice of saving themselves from this religio-political dictatorship. Nuns stand trial over massacres. Clergymen accused of genocide. There's an abundance of evidence from more priests accused of Rwandan genocide. There's abundance effort. Nuns are involved, it says here. Nuns were involved in the massacres. France linked with Rwandan deaths. They provided the guns and ammunition for the Catholic government there. And then the UN allows Roman Catholic murderers off in Rwanda. Why? Because they said, well, it's been 4 years since they've been arrested, so we've got to let them go home now. And so the perversion of justice has been on every front there. Rwandan Catholic bishop went on trial in Kigali, accused of direct involvement in the 1994 genocide, in which it is estimated that 800,000 Tutsis and moderate Hutus. There were moderate Catholics, like liberal Catholics today, says let's live with each other, right? It comes from the heart and our nature. Let's be tolerant towards others. So they were wiped out at the same time. Now we see the Pope turned his attention to Latin America, where liberation theology from the liberal branch of the Catholic Church started a movement. And much as I disagree with the principles of the priesthood of the Catholic Church, I can understand why the liberation theology started. There was, in Latin America, some of the best land was foreign owned, and cattle were being fattened up to go to feed Americans burgers at Burger King or McDonald's, and that while the local people starved. Well, any man, you don't have to be a Catholic or a Protestant, you only need to be a human being to know that that's not fair. And so, but this didn't make the religious beliefs of these Latin American priests right, but at least they had a little bit of compassion on their fellow men. But never mind, I'm not getting involved in politics tonight, who was right, who was wrong. The Pope turned his eyes to Latin America, where they decided to destroy the liberation theology movement because they saw it as Christianized communism. And so, sure enough, with Casey, who was Opus Dei, which was a conservative movement in America, mainly in Europe, of conservative Catholics, they were running the CIA, and they, with American money, they put a stop to liberation theology in Latin America. The Pope turned his eyes to Cuba next, and here we see the battle for Cuba's soul. And now we see here, look, Time magazine, God's man against secular humanists, the secular humanist Fidel Castro. Who's bugging Castro today? Once again, we see crowds under Roman Catholic payer, and his MCL is being organised by the Vatican to undermine communism and bring it down. And then we see, just last week, Aristide, the Roman Catholic priest, which these two beasts of Revelation 13 put in power in Haiti. And then we see here, America providing the ammunition and the guns for Catholic control of Haiti. And there we see Aristide, once again, brought the people out into the streets. The same principle to topple governments, bring the masses which you control out into the streets. Bring the masses which you control through teaching them that there is only salvation through the priest and the Catholic Church, and telling them that unless they obey explicitly without question what they're told, they will go to hellfire. And now we see the Vatican pushes for Timor independence. Here we see the rosary beads with the attack against the Muslim nation of Indonesia. And so we see, here's this man, Jose Ramos Horta, talking of a bloodbath to come in Timor. There's the Cardinal of Timor, or the Archbishop. Anarchy as Timorese flee the terror. And now we see East Timor tensions at boiling point, says Jose Ramos Horta. But who is this Jose Ramos Horta? He's a Roman Catholic priest. And what does he say? Horta says the same thing that was said in Poland and Eastern Europe and Haiti and Rwanda. But he warned, if Indonesia renews hostilities in the country, we will have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of East Timorese throughout the country, East Timor, going on the streets. And there we see them on the streets. Here we see them obeying the priests, the Roman Catholics, not questioning the priests. They immediately went onto the streets, causing reaction on the right slide from the Muslims, who were not going to be kicked out or made a minority. But that's the power of the priesthood. It's a military organisation, the Catholic Church, where they can have the people on the streets and destroy and overturn governments and get their new world order. Here we see the bishop is brought back. They go to their churches, they're praying. They think they're actually converting the world to God. But the only way that God permits the world to be converted is not with the sword or with political interference. It is through preaching the gospel, and people will accept or reject according to the dictates of their conscience, and then answer to God on the judgment day for their decisions. Heroic nuns, brave priests, they're working for God. Here we see the priests again and the nuns helping the people. And there's nothing wrong with that, but when they get into politics, it's wrong. And because they're helping against the evils of the Mohammedan faith in Indonesia, it doesn't necessarily make their religion right. And so here we see them bowing down before graven images in this great emergency, which we told last night the Roman Catholic Church stands indicted before an offended God for taking out the first and the second commandment. How do I know they've done that? They openly admit it. They say, yes, we've done that. We'll deal with that tomorrow night in more detail. Here we see the priests having the mass. Soldiers, Indonesia did react. They knew that the nuns were in a conspiracy, the same as Rwanda, and they started reacting by taking out nuns and priests who were getting involved in politics to overthrow the Indonesian government. The United Nations was brought in to help the Catholic cause in Timor. And then we see they dug up many graves, the priests found in mass grave. The Indonesians realised what they were doing. They were not fools, and they mowed a lot of them down. The Catholic Church think that they were killed as martyrs, but I would say that they paid the price for interfering in politics, which Jesus never did. Indonesia's East Timor rule ends, finally, after the pressure. Then we see Time magazine says a nation is born. And if we look at the little St. Christopher medal along here, we can see that it's a Roman Catholic nation, as this publication here points. Bringing hope back to East Timor, a new Catholic nation is born, but needs your help. That's from ACN, the Australian Catholic News, which I found in a Catholic church in Sydney, Australia. Now we go to China to see what they were doing there. China discovers the Vatican was behind the communists' fall. So Chinese government attacks Chinese Catholics. Here we see the Catholic leader saying, wild seas for the church, that's the Catholic Church in China, because there are 5 or 6 million Roman Catholics in China, and their first loyalty is not to the leadership of China, it's to their Lord God, the Pope, and the Vatican in Rome. And so the Chinese government said, we're not taking a dual loyalty. Your first loyalty is to your nation. And remember, I showed you last night that St. Peter, who was meant to be the first Pope, said, subject yourself to the earthly powers, the kings. But we were told that up until the point you subject yourself to the secular government, you obey it in all things until it tells you to do things that contradict your conscience according to the 10 Commandments, and then you follow God. And so we see the troubled seas in China. Here we see Roman Catholics from this Roman Catholic publication, religious freedom denied. Here we see the Catholics in China being put in their place by the Chinese army. This is the most interesting statement from August the 26th, 1991 Newsweek, under the heading of Public Enemy Number 1. As they watched the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe, China's aging leadership became convinced that the man most responsible for the party's sudden fall from grace was none other than Pope John Paul II. Last summer, internal party documents accused him of directing reactionary and subversive forces against communists everywhere. And now, in their determination to remain the last important communist power in the world, the Chinese are attempting to rout out all papist loyalties in their midst. Isn't that interesting? And so we see what happened, like everywhere else in the world, to topple the communist government. The Catholics in secret places and in power bought the people out by the millions into the streets of Beijing. But what happened? The Chinese government ruthlessly subdued it. And here's a poor man right here being squashed by a tank. Despair and death in Beijing Square. The policy here worked in Moscow. It worked in Warsaw. It worked in Bulgaria and Romania. It worked in Haiti. It worked in Timor. But it didn't work in Beijing. And who paid the price? The Catholic priests who were there in disguise? No, the poor people. Now, they might have wanted the overthrow of communism, but what they were going to get was Catholic officials to replace them. And I'm not too sure which I'd prefer to live under. Here we see the Chinese government warns the Pope not to meddle in China's affairs. Isn't that interesting? They knew what was going on. Now, Marcos's Freemason government falls to Catholic pressure in the Philippines. After the Pope visited the Philippines, they decided to get rid of Marcos. And so we see Aquino here was shot by the Freemason policemen in Marcos's government. They had said to him, you shoot Aquino when he comes off the plane, and who was going to stand against Marcos in free elections, you shoot him and we'll promote you to become the chief of police. But they didn't tell him that there was a man standing behind him to put a bullet in the back of his head, right? Because dead men don't tell tales. And they just said he was a fanatical policeman. That's happened with Jack Ruby, right, in America, with the killing of John F. Kennedy, with King Faisal in Saudi Arabia. They told his grandson, you shoot Faisal, we'll make you the king, and you'll be the wealthiest man in the world. This is Freemasonry in action. And so Aquino got killed. There's Cardinal Sin over his body, and Cardinal Sin makes his widow, Cory Aquino, the president of the Philippines through the Catholic vote. Cardinal Sin orders the people out into the streets to stop the Ferdinand Marcos's tanks. So we see the continual use of Catholics on the street to get their way. And this is an amazing statement. I, that's Cardinal Sin, called on my people through the church radio to go into the streets and help General Ramos and Mr. Enriles. Within 30 minutes, there were 2 million on the streets. Now that's power, isn't it? That you can control people in such a way. Within 30 minutes, there were 2 million on the streets. Catholic nuns on the streets in the Philippines Revolution. During the peaceful revolution which toppled President Marcos of the Philippines in 1986, nuns offered the troops rosaries and the people gave them sandwiches. The tanks withdrew. Remember, friends, all this is stemmed from the Pope. At the beginning of his bishopric in 1978, he actually made the appeal for Roman Catholics to get more militant and to get into positions of secular and strategic power within the governments to bring this world back to Jesus, to make this world Christian. But friends, they're deceived because, as I mentioned before, the only way to make the world Christian is through preaching and let people make up their own mind whether they'll accept Jesus Christ as their personal saviour or not. Over the weekend, a group of Navy and Army officers failed in a mutiny attempt, prompting Manila's Catholic Archbishop Jaime Cardinal Sin to call on the masses to pour into the streets to defend the president. This was in another case. They were revolting against Aquino, Cory Aquino, and Cardinal Sin called the people out to protect her. And there's Aquino meets the Pope. Now we find in Australia the Vatican helpers behind the drive for Australian Republic. The Protestant British monarchy must go. Now here we see New South Wales welcoming the Irish Catholics. The Irish Catholics were allowed to come to Australia. They came to New Zealand and other parts of the Commonwealth. They were allowed to practice their superstitions, which was really baptised paganism, which the Protestants believed. And they were allowed to practice their religion because the principles of the British Empire and Protestantism gave them that right. But they used their position through the direction of the priests, not to thank the British Protestants for allowing them to come, but to use it to infiltrate into every strategic position of political power to turn Australia into a republic. Why is it that Irish Catholics in Australia and New Zealand are pushing for a republic? Why? Simply because we are part of the British Commonwealth and we're under the jurisdiction of the monarchy, which is Protestant. And we have the best systems in the world. How do we know? Because everybody from other republics want to come and live in our country, right? And then these people want to change our system. I believe it's not ignorance. I believe it's treachery. And those who would plan to wish us to follow or travel into the uncharted waters of republicanism, I believe that, as I said last night, it is part of our conspiracy. And so we see in Australia, in the 1860s, this was Prince Alfred, one of Queen Victoria's sons. he went on a visit on a British naval squadron to Sydney, where Mr. Farrell here, who was an Irish Catholic Fenian, or what you'd call today an IRA member, he shot him twice in the back. How the Protestant at the show where he shot him didn't string him up on the lamppost right there is a miracle only known to God. And yet there was an anti-Catholic sentiment flowed right throughout the British Empire after the Queen's son was wounded. He miraculously recovered, but there was anti-Catholic feeling throughout the British Commonwealth, mainly because they felt that the Catholics' first loyalty was to the Pope and his means of wanting to control the world. Father Kelly, I do not mind blood, I do not mind slaughter, I do not mind revolution, so long as we get what we wish to accomplish. That's a far cry from the humble Jesus who said, harm no man and do good to those who despitefully use you. Now we see Cardinal Mannix. He lived to be about 98. He was the head Catholic bishop in Australia. There is Billy Hughes, the Prime Minister of Australia, with the Australian troops in France, and because of the treachery, he said, Cardinal Mannix, or Archbishop Mannix, is a traitor to Australia and the British Commonwealth. Why? Because we know from last night's slides that the Vatican was behind the Germany and Austria in their quest to topple the democracies and so-called atheistic France, which had separated the power of church and state, and also Orthodox Russia was in their sights. But he actually caused a referendum in Australia, ordered all Catholics to vote for the Australian troops to be pulled out of the line, and no Australians fought in the last battle of the First World War. And Billy Hughes said, Mannix, you're a traitor. Why? Because he was following his Lord God the Pope. His first loyalty was to the Vatican, who wanted the British to be beaten in the war, and not to his nation, which had fed him and supported him. And so, friends, now this might surprise some of you, but H.W. Crittenden, the author of Behind the Black Curtain, believes that the Curtin Chifley Irish Catholic government in Australia, at the outbreak of war, knew that the Vatican-Japanese Concordat made allowances for Singapore to fall. Someone gave secret orders for the Australian Army to fall back without a real fight. This left the British flank exposed, and the inevitable was the fall of Singapore. And 70,000 young men were taken into Japanese concentration camps, and many of them never saw their loved ones again. That's the treachery of Roman Catholic officers of the Australian Army. They had boatloads of reserves off the coast they could have put into the battle and saved the day. And yet the Catholics followed the Pope's dictates because Pius XII was behind Hitler. And so Singapore fell really without a fight due to Catholic treachery. Now we see Bob Hawke, the secular humanist, when the Pope visited Australia. We see the dignitaries of church and the army, all Roman Catholics, at his reception. And then soon as he left, we see the Catholic power in Australia get rid of Bob Hawke, and Mr. Paul Keating comes on the scene, a good Irish Catholic. And what happened? Keating admits it was the Catholic in him that pushed for republicanism. Isn't that interesting? Why? To shake off the British Protestant crown, which has been a wart on the Catholic back for years, according to them. When they disposed of the Protestant Privy Council, they set up the High Court of Australia, and 6 of the 7 High Court judges were Roman Catholics they were 6 of the 7 High Court judges were Roman Catholics. And yet, then they started letting pedophile priests off. Do you see where they can, and let other people that were making Catholics in high positions that had committed crimes, they were let off. And now we see, once upon a time, the stamps had the monarchy on them, but now we see they have Mary with halos and all other Catholic symbols. We see the Queen has been taken off the Australian $5 note without the people of Australia being asked, and then some old biddy has been put in her place, as you can see here. And then now we see what happened at Port Arthur. Now, this is a tragedy where this man who was on Prozac got the blame for shooting 34 tourists at the tourist attraction of Port Arthur in Tasmania. And immediately after he was arrested for the shooting, they burnt down the house and destroyed the evidence where he was found. And then as a result, Can new gun laws stop another Port Arthur massacre? New gun laws is that a disarming conclusion. Look at the guns. Shocked by last year's Port Arthur massacre, Australians have handed in more than 500,000 outlawed guns. What some cynics believe is that there is a power in the world that is prepared to set up these tragedies, fill people with Prozac, get them to carry out things, and then take guns off law-abiding citizens. Why? Because the New World Order will see the leaders and the priests armed, or the Roman Catholic governments of these nations armed, but you and I will be disarmed. That's what their goal is. And now we see, was Port Arthur a conspiracy to hasten gun control? A lot of Australians have asked this question, and it's on a lot of people's minds. Miss Hanson comments follow a One Nation newsletter, that's a political party, she was a politician, that suggested the massacre was a conspiracy designed to allow the government to crack down on gun ownership. They immediately charged her with tax evasion, and they put her in jail for about 3 years. But there was such a hue and cry from honest Australians, even honest Catholics in Australia. They said, no, you've set her up, and there was so much rage that they had to let her out. But that's what can happen to you. You can get a tax investigation if you step out of line with Big Brother. Then we see the head of the Australian Army is Roman Catholic Cosgrove, who served in Timor. And now we see tougher religious hate laws coming soon. Soon, what I'm telling you, I'll be put in jail for. Not quite here, but there's some laws in the European Union that will forbid you and myself to gather here and ask questions of why is England being forced into the European Union, and what will its lot be for us and our heritage, our progeny. Here's some interesting letters here. Catholics are well represented in the Republican movement. They say we owe no allegiance to an English woman from the other side of the planet. Yet their first allegiance is to a Polish Pope in Italy. Isn't that interesting? It is often forgotten that the Queen is the defender of the Protestant faith. As many Australians are Catholics and owe their allegiance to Italy and the Vatican, could this political debate end up being a religious one? Well, it sure is. And eventually the Australians had a referendum on whether they should reject the monarchy. And all the Catholic Republicans were so cocky that it was going to be pulled off. But you see, there were tears as I watched them on the news that night. There were tears in their eyes as they got resoundingly beaten, despite the newspapers of Rupert Murdoch, who's been given a papal award for his troubles, telling everybody that was a foregone conclusion and telling them that they should vote for a republic. Not that they told us what benefits it would be other than getting politically appointed judges and more corrupt Catholics in power. But the Catholic immigration since the Second World War had been quite amazing. But do you know what? There were many, many good Catholics that came to Australia, and they said, we're going to retain the Queen. Why? Because we're quite happy. We've left these republics in Europe or nations in Europe, and we've got a wonderful life here. We've prospered under this system, and we're going to keep the monarchy. And that shocked many of them, and it showed that many Catholics were not following the urgings of the priests as much as they used to. And that's a good thing. Now we see in New Zealand the same thing happened. We see the Pope visited New Zealand, and David Lange, our Prime Minister, he was a secular humanist, and straight after the visit of the Pope, what happened? He gets overturned, and Irish Catholic Jim Bolger came to power. And he had an oath to the Queen as Prime Minister, but he also had an oath to the Pope as a Catholic. And if he had to choose between the both oaths, last night or tonight, last night I showed you those statements where they said they would follow the Pope, and it's better that 10,000 queens be dumped than the Lord God, the Pope. And now we see the Prime Minister of Australia and the Prime Minister of New Zealand meeting in Queenstown, New Zealand. They were both Irish Catholics and both Republicans. And here we see Mr. Upton, a Member of Parliament, saying, Mr. Upton said he was not surprised it was a Prime Minister of Irish Catholic descent who was testing the waters of republicanism in New Zealand. And now we see that in reality what's happening. These two Irish Catholic Prime Ministers, they're helping to pull the Queen off the Protestant British throne. And who's coming in? The Pope with his New World Order. And there are some of the things that Jim Bolger is doing. We're getting a republic by stealth. He's destroying the Queen's honours, destroying the Privy Council, removing the Queen from the New Zealand law, changing our flag, removing Queen from our currency and stamps, removing the Queen's chain. And he gave $300,000 of taxpayers' money to the Irish government. Isn't that interesting? Now we see Malachi Martin making this statement. Our way of life as individuals and as citizens of the nations, our families and our jobs, our trade and commerce and money, our educational systems and our religions and our culture, even the badges of our national identity, that's stamps and money and etc., flags, which most of us have always taken for granted, all will have been powerfully and radically altered forever. No one can be exempt from its effects. No sector of our lives will remain untouched. The keys of his blood, Malachi Martin, page 15. He's since died. He should know what the Jesuits are up to. And here we have a politician, Damien O'Connor. Have a guess what religious persuasion he is? An Irish Catholic. And he's calling to dump our flag. Why? Because they don't want that there, the symbol of the Protestant British monarchy, the Union Jack. They don't want it there. And they're enjoying life in these countries, in these beautiful Protestant countries, and having liberty to worship God according to the way they think, but they don't want you and I to have the same privilege. Here we see the Queen was once on all our banknotes, but now she's only on one. We've got to be politically correct, we've got to have a woman, and we've got to have a Mary, and so it goes on, and the politically correct New World Order. Now we see our stamps. They had pictures of the monarchy on them, but now we see the blue and the gold halos of popery. And now we see the blue and the gold in Excelsior Gloria. Now, the Catholics have taken over in New Zealand. Now we see all the Catholic stamps, the Christmas stamps with the halos. And this is a very interesting stamp here. Look at it. New Zealand, $1.50 last Christmas. There's Jesus. He's falling out of the crib. But joint issue Vatican New Zealand stamp. Isn't that interesting? Joint issue from the Vatican in New Zealand. And now we see the politicians are calling for the Privy Council tie to England to be dumped. Now we see the SIS bills can break into your home, as they did it once upon a time. An Englishman's home was considered to be his castle. Thank you. But now we see what happened in the time of the Reformation. Here we see a Protestant caught by a Catholic soldier or pimp for reading the Bible. What a crime. And he was executed for his troubles. Can you see the hand sign? Can you see the papal hand sign? We saw it last night on the Berlin street mobs. And so we see now that with our digital photograph driver's licenses, the New World Order must have control over the people. That's why there is this massive centralising of economic and political power into fewer and fewer hands. Police state requires personal ID to be carried at all times. One thing, friends, that is happening to us is that we're totally reliant on the supermarkets and the power company and the water company for our livelihood. And it's very, very easy when the mark of the beast comes, and no man shall buy nor sell unless he receives the mark of the beast, then you'll be forced to go along with the mark of the beast to get your sustenance. Now, I live in the country and I've lived there for 15 years, and I'm saying that I've got an orchard in, I'm not self-sufficient, I've got a good vegetable garden in, I've got my own water supply, and I'm not in debt to the Jewish-owned Freemasonry banks. But I am, no man is an island, but at least for those people that are totally reliant on the supermarkets, it's going to mean that they're going to have to make some tough decisions in the near future when the mark of the beast comes. And so we see now, in Australia we had the shoot-up with this man on Prozac in Port Arthur, and they had 500,000 guns taken off law-abiding citizens as a result of it. Now we see in Raurimu, we had another man, a psychiatric patient, who was on Prozac-type drugs, had a shoot-up, and 7 New Zealanders were killed, right? And what happened? Firearms, the government is now resolving to take firearms off law-abiding citizens. The same as in America. They want to take firearms off law-abiding citizens. But the government will be better armed than they've ever been before. Will the elite police squads like this call at your home next? Well, I don't know, but they had a setback in Australia recently when the special SWAT teams that call on people who, on their doors, they were, what would you say, practicing nighttime flying in close formation. And I think there was 18 of these armed police officers or soldiers in one helicopter and 18 in the other, and they collided in mid-air and crashed, and 36 of them got killed. Not that we wish that upon them and their grieving families, but they will be used, those type of army teams, to dispose of anybody who's not politically correct. That means if you don't laugh at the right time, or if you don't say the right thing at the right time, then you can be put away in jail or shot. Will the Vatican and the United States rule the world? Here we see these two powers of Revelation 13, which have diametrically opposed principles uniting against all the obvious evils in the world. Here we see the Uncle Sam reaching across the abyss to take hands with the forefathers of America's avowed enemy. Here we see the different characteristics of the lamb-like beast, that's the one there, that would speak loudly as a dragon, and the healed beast, and the healed beast of Revelation 13, which was the papacy. Here we see on the left that Rome plans to Catholicize America. And it states here in Ryan and Miller, two Jesuits, in their book, The State and Church, they make mention the danger of religious intolerance towards non-Catholics in the United States is so improbable and so far in the future that it should not occupy their time or attention. Friends, that was in 1924, which was what, about 79, 80 years ago, actually. And now we see the principle of the lamb-like beast, Patrick Henry. Religion can be directed only by reason and conviction, not by force, and therefore all men are equally entitled to the free exercise of religion, according to the dictates of conscience, unpunished and unrestrained by the magistrate. Here we see Pius IX. The Church has the right to require that the Catholic religion shall be the only religion of the state, to the exclusion of all others, Pope Pius IX. James Madison, religion is not in the purview of human government. It is essentially distinct from it and exempt from its cognizance. A connection between them is injurious to both. Now we see, cursed be those who assert liberty of conscience and of worship, and such that maintain that the Church may not employ force. Our form of government is one based wholly on the will of the people. The state is free from all control of the churches. All these principles have been formally condemned by Rome. Now we see the first beast. If Catholics ever gain a sufficient numerical majority in this country, religious freedom is at an end. Abraham Lincoln. We owe it to popery that we now see our land reddened by the blood of our noblest sons. I pity the priests when the people realise that they are responsible for the bloodshed in this war. That was the Civil War. And now we see, I want to hear some Americans stand up and shout, give us justice, give us